So good afternoon. This hearing will now come to order. As the hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members, you are responsible for muting and unmuting yourselves. If I notice that you are recognized, that you have not unmuted yourself, I'll ask the staff to send you a request to unmute yourself. Please then accept that request so you are no longer muted. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time is expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of the speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member, then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority, and finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we've set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Okay, done with the technical part. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second public witness hearing on tribal programs under the jurisdiction of the Interior and Environment Appropriations Subcommittee. Due to the ongoing pandemic, we are still not back to normal for public witness hearings. However, this year we are having 2 hearings. Yesterday, we heard about national Indian country priorities to inform the fiscal year 2023 annual appropriation. Today, we'll focus on regional Indian country priorities. As in 2022, we've also solicited testimony from individual tribes to focus on specific tribal priorities. That testimony was received last month. A lot has happened since we last met. Indian country is struggling with the effects of a pandemic that have resulted in loss of lives, including many tribal elders and fluent native language speakers, shut down tribal governments, and shuttered schools. The pandemic's mental health impacts on Native Americans are devastating, and will need long-term assistance to address. I'm very grateful that President Biden is honoring the nation's treaty and trust responsibility to address these issues. I also look forward to his focus on the climate change crisis and the need to transition to clean energy that is impacting not only the nation, but the world. Like the pandemic, Native America is on the front lines of the climate change crisis and has an important role to play in leading the way to a cleaner, healthier future. For fiscal year 2023, President Biden proposes $2.8 billion for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, $583 million above the fiscal year 2022 enacted level. This includes much needed increases of an additional $38 million for public safety and justice programs and construction projects, plus an additional $104 million for natural resources management to continue investments to address climate change and pivot to cleaner energy. Further, the budget proposes to reclassify contract support costs and payment for tribal leases as mandatory. For the Bureau of Indian Education, the president requests $4.5 billion, which is $294 million above the fiscal year 2022 enacted level. The president proposes to make a substantial investment in education construction with a requested increase of $156 million. I recently met with leaders from the National Indian Education Association, where we discussed the need for additional infrastructure investment. This requested increase is much needed. For the Indian Health Service, the president proposes to reclassify the entire budget as mandatory. The proposal is not within the subcommittee's jurisdiction. Since no discretionary funds were requested, I look forward to today's testimony on priority areas in the event Congress has not reclassified the service accounts before we pass the annual discretionary appropriation bill. I'm pleased to welcome tribal organizations to discuss regional needs and challenges facing Indian country. I'm eager to learn more about your issues and priorities, and I look forward to our discussions on these issues because I believe it will help to inform us as we begin to develop the 2023 appropriations bill. Each witness's full written statement will be introduced into the record, so please do not feel pressured to cover everything orally. After we hear the testimony of each witness on the panel, members will have the opportunity to ask questions. And with that, I am happy to yield to my friend, Mr. Joyce, for his remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for continuing these important hearings to get input from tribal leaders on a wide array of programs under this subcommittee's jurisdiction. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the distinguished tribal leaders testifying today. This is day 2 of the subcommittee's traditional 2-day annual listening sessions with tribal leaders. I know we all look forward to the day when we can return to full-day sessions and visit with tribal leaders from around our nation. Our witnesses today have a difficult job of representing a diverse array of interests from hundreds of sovereign nations across the country. I represent the northeast corner of Ohio, which was once the land of the Miami, Seneca, and others. I'm humbled to be joining you today in my capacity as ranking member on Interior Committee, perhaps now more than ever. As I said yesterday, Indian country recently lost a true leader in Capitol Hill with the passing of my fellow Native American Caucus Vice Chair and Alaska's sole voice in the House for nearly 5 decades, Congressman Don Young. Though a non-official member of this subcommittee, he always looked forward to these annual tribal meetings. Excuse me here, since I don't know what just happened there. I'm sorry. Get a call in the middle while you're doing one of these things is ruins me. I apologize for that.
We all understand the complicated technology.
Like Don Young and many others in Congress, I recognize that upholding the tribal trust obligation is a responsibility shared by all members of Congress, regardless of the congressional district. I also realize the federal government still has a long way to go before fully meeting its trust and treaty obligations. I suspect we'll hear about the important work that remains to be done from our distinguished witnesses this afternoon. That's why my position on Appropriations Committee is a great honor, but it's also a heavy responsibility. But fortunately, I have a friend and partner in Chairwoman Pingree, and it's my sincere hope that we'll continue the hard work of our predecessors for more than a decade to increase the federal commitment to meeting those trust and treaty obligations. So I look forward to listening and learning from the testimony today and working with my chair and the rest of my colleagues in the days and weeks ahead to help you in this next fiscal year. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Joyce, and thank you for your kind words. I look forward to working on this with you, and I am also pleased you mentioned our departed colleague, Don Young. We're all going to miss him very much and his important commitment to Indian country. Do any other members wish to make an opening statement? Okay, seeing none, we will begin to hear the testimony from our witnesses. And thank you all so much for taking your time to be with us today. We're really looking forward to having a conversation with you. I will begin by recognizing Mr. Kirk Francis, the president of the United South and Eastern Tribes. And I feel very fortunate to have Chief Francis as a chief of an important Penobscot tribe in our state. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today, and it's always good to hear your voice. So thank you so much for joining us, and please go ahead with your remarks.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and it's great to see you as well. And so Congresswoman Pingree, Ranking Member Joyce, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to allow me to provide testimony. My name is Kirk Francis. I serve as president of the United South and Eastern Tribes Sovereignty Protection Fund. I am also proudly serving as chief of Penobscot Indian Nation in the great state of Maine. We are here today to both celebrate historic proposals in the president's budget and to request in the president's budget request, and to also once again remind you all that the federal government continues to fail to deliver upon us its obligations to tribal nations and Native people. This failure has persisted regardless of changes in administration of Congress. Despite numerous reports, investigations, recommendations, and consistent advocacy from Indian country, it's been evident in the 2003 Quiet Crisis Report, the 2018 Broken Promises Report, and the way COVID-19 has ravaged our nation's people and communities. Deep and chronic failures require bold, systematic changes. And I'm sorry, Congresswoman, am I not on camera?
No, you're not. It's a tribal symbol, not you.
So I just got a notice from your staff. Is that better?
It is. Technology is jinxed today, so we're just going to expect this to happen.
Deep and chronic failures require bold, systematic changes, some of which now have been proposed by the president. This is not a question about addressing poverty and needs across Indian country. Our relationship with the United States is ultimately about honor, fulfilling commitments and promises. The solutions we offer involve a fundamental shift in federal Indian policy and funding. They will allow Indian country to realize its great potential and create lasting positive change for tribal nations and our people. It is critical that the administration propose and Congress demand budgets containing full funding for all federal Indian agencies and programs. Given our history and unique relationship, this funding can no longer be subject to the instability of discretionary spending. We must achieve full and mandatory funding for all federal Indian agencies and programs. And the President's unprecedented request for IHS, though not entirely reflective of the tribal estimate for full funding, is an excellent start. The process under which OMB develops budgets and policy that impact us require reform also. We believe a strong tribal affairs office should be created at OMB. In concert with this office, OMB must be required to produce full, detailed accountings of the federal funding distributed to Indian country, including only what tribal nations access, not what funds are which we are technically eligible for. While we are appreciative of the inclusion of funding for tribal nations in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, this level of funding is insufficient to address centuries of unmet infrastructure obligations. A much greater federal investment is necessary to rebuild tribal nation infrastructure and economies. Similar to the US investment in the rebuilding of post-World War II Europe via the Marshall Plan, the legislative and executive branches should commit to the same investment to rebuild tribal nations. As we await further details on the President's request for FY23, we celebrate the historic nature of the administration's proposal to move IHS and other funding to the mandatory side of the budget, as well as a plan to begin to close gaps in IHS funding. We are pleased to see the proposed $1.1 billion increase to programs within DOI Indian Affairs. However, we also note the historic and continued unmet funding obligation with regards to BIA's diverse line items. The recent Taloa report cites the full funding obligation of just public safety and justice lines at $3 billion. While we firmly believe all Indian country funding should be fully funded today, including the IHS, we recognize that the Biden administration has taken a positive step forward in its proposal to move us closer to that reality. We now call upon Congress and this subcommittee in particular to work with tribal nations and the administration to fulfill the government's responsibilities and to assure that these proposals are enacted. While each member of Congress shares equally in trust and treaty obligations, you have a unique understanding of these obligations, including unmet funding obligations, and more importantly, an opportunity to drive historic change. You know how the chronic underfunding of IHS has contributed to the lack of access to care, health disparities, and preventable death in Indian country, especially during the COVID crisis. We ask that you join us in supporting the administration's proposal for IHS, as well as CSC and 105L, and use this knowledge in conversations with colleagues. We know that it will take tribal leaders and advocates, the administration, and congressional appropriators working together to enact these. In closing, we implore you to lead the change within Congress that is necessary to improve how the United States views, honors, and fulfills its promises to Indian country. The federal budget is a reflection of this commitment. We recognize that there are many issues that this body considers. However, we ask that you always remember this nation's first promise to its first people, the promise that resulted in an exchange responsible for the vast wealth, power, and influence of this great country. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Chief Francis. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Julie Kitka, the president of the Alaska Federation of Natives.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and ranking member and members of the committee. It's my honor to testify today. I serve as the president of the Alaska Federation of Natives, a long-term president. I want to first thank you for recognizing our long-term congressman who passed away on March 18th. He served, was in his 25th term, 49 years in that distinguished body. I don't think that we've ever really remembered anybody else serving in that position on that. And so I want to thank you for allowing him to lie in the statutory hall, the respect that was given. And we are working with our governor on some possible opportunities, naming opportunities to be appropriately respectful of his contributions to rebuilding our state on that. But thank you for all the courtesies. And he was a character. We know that there were many things that people liked and little controversies and so on that, but he had a kind heart and he really, truly, deeply loved the Native people of Alaska and across the country and did his best. I also want to thank you for the Congress's support in the CARES funding and the American Rescue and the infrastructure on that. These are historic levels of funding and effort directed in our communities on that, and they really are making a difference. When we first were assessing models on the COVID, the medical models of how that would impact our population, we were scared to death. The worst case model had projections of deaths of 14,000 of our people just in Anchorage and Mat-Su within 3 months. Fortunately, through the interventions of the health system and everybody's efforts and just the trajectory of the virus itself, we didn't have that level of death. I believe we've had about about 250,000 cases in our state, and the death rate has been hovering, I believe, about a little under 2,000 on that. But again, we threw everything into supporting our tribal health system. Everybody threw everything into working cooperatively with the state. For the first time ever, we had our governor request a unified command from the Secretary of Defense. And so we had a very streamlined response working with the federal and the state and FEMA and everybody. And I really, truly believe it was everybody working together with a good deal of luck that we survived what we did. But we are putting those resources to good use. We're repairing and replenishing our health system and building back up our capabilities. For the record, I'd like my written comments to be considered of some of the regional priorities up here. I reiterate the need for further funding for public safety and bring to your attention, we have over 60 of our remote rural communities that have no on-the-ground public safety presence at all. And in this security climate that we're dealing with just across our border, a very aggressive Russia, and seeing what's happening in Ukraine and the additional national security challenges up here, it's totally unacceptable not to have public safety and domain awareness all around our vast land. So I really want to urge you to support increasing the public safety and making sure it gets to where it's needed, but also communications, supporting expanding communications. Historic levels of funding put out into expansion of broadband, and we just need to see that's deployed wisely. One need that we see on that is the need for coordinating mechanisms between tribal funding and funding that goes to the state on that. There's also historic levels going into state governments, and we want to make sure there's no gaps. And so focus on setting up coordinating mechanisms of federal, state, tribal is really, really much needed, both on broadband as well as in infrastructure spending on that. Again, we know these are historic levels and we don't want to waste a dollar. We want to stretch them as far as we can. But unless we're coordinating all together on that, the risk of things falling through the cracks are high. Again, in prioritizing resiliency, climate change is hitting our communities. We see high levels of erosion. We have multiple forums that we've had on the damages to erosion, both to our airports and to our hospitals and our clinics and our military's erosion concerns, housing, community buildings, the erosion, the melting of the permafrost, the release of methane gas, lots of challenges in the climate change that need to be addressed. And again, the resiliency and adaptation to change is going to be critical. Another one I want to bring to your attention is the need on food security. We recently had 15 of our hunters that were stranded as they didn't get the fish in their communities and went further afield to hunt for beluga whales and seals and got stranded because of the freeze up on the rivers on that. And they were needing to fill their home freezers and food sources for their community. So the climate change also impacts greatly food security and the ability for people to continue their way of life. So I want to bring that to your attention. Also want to encourage you to support public-private partnerships. That is the way that we're going to make our leap forward on economic development and economic recovery. We can't do it all on government funding. We need to be able to reach out and build these partnerships, both tribal partnerships with government, but also bringing in other private sectors in that. So with that, I want to leave you with one thought. One of the most effective federal models for moving federal resources to our communities is the compacting model. I want to urge you to expand the legal ability for compacting to occur in other departments, such as Department of Justice, dealing with public safety, but also Department of Education. We have asked for a solicitor's opinion on using the Department of Interior's compacting authority to flow other resources into compacting from other departments and are awaiting that. We are in the
Can
process.
I get you to wrap up? I'm sorry to interrupt.
My final comment is urge you to support federal, state, tribal compacting. We have just gotten a education compacting demonstration model out of our state Senate on that, and it will be among the first federal, state, tribal compacts. And we really do think that there's some coordination and some innovation that can occur in that. So with that, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this morning.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time. Next, we have Mr. Cyril Smokey, the president of Intertribal Council of Nevada. Please go ahead with your remarks. Thank you.
Omaheji, I'm Cyril Smokey. I'm chairman of the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California, also the president of the Intertribal Council of Nevada. Today I'm speaking on behalf of the 27 tribes in the state of Nevada, and thank you for your time. I'm going to start off with environmental issues. Funding for environmental. Nevada is a huge mining state. Along with mining comes a lot of environmental issues. Air and water quality standards. Our Superfund sites have been set back by decades from previous administration removing EPA and putting in public relations specialists. So now we're trying to reestablish all work that was previously done and get back to a solid base so we can move forward. General assistance programs, state and tribal assistance grants funding has remained stagnant for decades, close to 20 years now, without giving anything more back to the tribes. They give us the bare minimum to even maintain operations within environmental areas within our tribe. Living in the desert, water is a rare commodity. It always has. Nevada has a lot of desert. With that, I'm going to bring up climate change. Whether you believe in climate change or not, in the state of Nevada, we are seeing the serious effects of it. Mainly for the dryness, the lack of water, the lack of snow that we get every year. Wildfires were huge. Tribal lands have lost thousands of acres this year, more than in a long time. So we're seeing the effects. Along with that comes the loss of cultural plants, medicines, and these things weren't only just wiped out from the fires, they were being wiped out before that because we're not getting the weather that we used to. But unless we take action, they're just going to die off naturally. They will not grow back naturally. Action needs to be taken. Funding needs to be provided for that, for restoration. All we have is the hopes that in the future, our future generations will be able to know what these cultural, traditional plants and medicines were instead of them being in history books. So we need to take action now. I'll give you a specific example for us, the Washoe people. Our tagum is the pine nuts and the pine nut trees, half wiped out by the fire, the other half drying out because of bug infestations, because we don't get the snowpacks that Nevada used to get. Now, along with that, there's also programs for cultural language, historical preservation. Many of the tribes in the state of Nevada are very small and very rural. So we're spread out all across these land bases. And when program funding comes down through as competitive grants, we don't qualify for them, or we don't have the capacity to fulfill the needs that the grant is expected to. So funding needs to be provided to make changes in those policies so that we'll also fall under the Department of Interior, because that's where most of the tribal monies usually come from. Law enforcement, public safety, emergency services. And within the state of Nevada, we have a huge setback, especially for those tribes that don't have their own law enforcement or their own court systems. We have wait times of up to delays of up to 45 minutes response times for that would be their fires, life or death situations, including homicides that have happened that have taken over 40 minutes to get a response from a tribal law enforcement officer. So there's a huge deficiency there. Along with everybody else, IHS, within the state of Nevada, we don't have an IHS facilities. Being under the Phoenix region, the closest IHS facility is in Phoenix, which is an average of 12 hours away from northern Nevada tribes, which is where the majority of the Nevada tribes are located. Behavioral health is a huge issue affecting every community and every reservation. I know there was a discussion even yesterday about advanced appropriations, mandatory appropriations, including the word mandatory funding. That all needs to be clearly defined for tribes so that we know exactly what we're getting into. We know what we can expect from year to year on a year-to-year basis. We had 2019, we had the longest shutdown, and we had clinics within the state of Nevada that were shutting down that could not service our people. In closing, I would just like to say that I hope these hearings, consultations are all taken seriously. I really appreciate the work that is all being done by the committees and subcommittees. And I want to remind everybody that we as tribes, we're here because of the trust responsibility of the government. We did not choose this. We were told that this is the route that we had to go. And as long as we are going to be not allowed to be true sovereign nations, as is under the definition of trust responsibility, then we want to uphold and make sure that the government is doing what's best for our tribal nations and taking everybody's comments seriously. And I look forward to working with everybody. I look forward to future collaborations, and I hope we can all come together and do the right thing for Native people and Indian country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments. And yes, we do put a very high value on your comments and your testimony today. So thank you for participating. Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Harold Frazier, the chairman of the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association. Please go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committee. One of the biggest, my name is Harold Frazier, chairman of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, as well as the chairman of the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association. One of the things that's really been a big issue for us is roads. It's been billions of dollars that come out for infrastructure. However, Congress has developed a formula, and this formula does not benefit large land-based tribes. Give you an example, we have a 3.1 million acre reservation and we only get 2.2 million. And there's just not enough money to really, so we're constantly doing a lot of patchworks here and there. One of the initiatives that we believe in is that Congress needs to develop a Indian reservation road program where this funding is just for Indian reservations that have roads. And I really believe that there has been a program years ago, but it's been faded out into transportation facilities, which really does not benefit a lot of the, not only Cheyenne River Sioux Indian Reservation, but a lot of Great Plains tribes. Another big issue that, however, that really assists us is road maintenance funding. And right now I'm at the understanding that that area has been cut. So we really hope that could be restored. Another thing that is we're hoping for is increased, and I'm glad you mentioned that the President Biden is going to increase school construction. That's something that is highly needed here on our reservation, and we are in discussion with the BIA for a new school and a new campus. So another impact that we want to discuss is Head Start. Here on Cheyenne River Sioux Indian Reservation, we have 9 centers, and they're scattered across our reservation, which is over 3.1 million acres. Right now, we get a funding of $2.7 million, and that's our entire budget. And of that is 1.7 is in salaries. So 62% of our funding is in salaries. But our Head Start teachers and teachers aid are severely underpaid. Give you a couple quick examples here on Cheyenne River. A lot of teachers that work for the BIA, they get started out at $30 an hour, and our Head Start teachers get $20 an hour. And the teachers aides at our BIE schools here are paid between $15 and $20 an hour. And with the tribal Head Starts, they're only paid $9 an hour. And I bring these up because I think it's high time that this Head Start program is really looked at. They're the first to start educating our babies. So I think that this needs to be one of the high priorities. Another thing that's really impacting our reservation and throughout Great Plains is meth. And something that we need help in is treatment. Right now, there's no funding available for meth treatment centers and or even programs. I mean, IHS, we have been there numerous times to try to get, if not funding, some assistance on developing good, successful programs to get our people off the drug and back to the way they should be. Another impact is drought. That's something that we're faced with, is drought, and it's a pretty that's one of the things that's the driving force of our reservation is agriculture. But when we talk about drought, we need programs that will really benefit native ranchers. And things get changed, a lot of regs get changed at the states and the county levels. And I think it's high time that this funding for agriculture is sent directly to tribes. So that's something that we believe in. And I want to say, thank you guys for the infrastructure dollars. However, very disappointed when it comes to the infrastructure. A lot of trust responsibilities of the government was left out. Give you a quick example. There was no big dollars, no dollars I've seen for law enforcement, for education, and for roads. A lot of it was to close old mines and things like that. And we kind of looked at that infrastructure bill, was that it appeared to be that the government was paying and cleaning up old debts instead of really helping us progress, because IHS was fortunate. They received some billions of dollars for water and sewer infrastructure. But one of the things that really is not very helpful, that we need to change some language so that these funds can be used for development. Right now, we're being told that these monies are only for existing systems that are not deficient no longer or anymore. So it really stunts our development and the growth of a lot of our tribes. So again, I want to say thank you for allowing me to testify, and wish you guys all a good day, unless there's any questions.
Thank you so much. Well, we'll look forward to having a conversation with you, and thank you for your remarks. So last, we have Mr. Melvin Sheldon, who is the first Vice President of Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Good morning, or I should say good afternoon to all of you. Chairwoman Pingree, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the House Interior Environment and Related Agencies Subcommittee. Thank you, OCM, for this opportunity to testify, especially on the upcoming fiscal year budget. Mel Sheldon, I've served on Tulalip Tribes for going on my 23rd year in council, and been on ATNI for 12 years, and currently the Pacific Northwest delegate at NCAI. ATNI has been run since 1953, and we represent 57 tribal governments from Oregon, Idaho, Washington, Southeast Alaska, Northern California, Western Montana, and Nevada. And so we probably, today's testimony will be more of a higher view, trying to bring out all of our issues that may be in common with all of our tribes in that we work with. So Also, I'd like to say thank you to the tribal leaders, chairs, and delegates who've spoke before me so eloquent and sharing the important issues that they represent in their geographic areas. My hands up to all of you. First of all, I'd like to thank you again for this last year, 222, the amount of money that was in the Consolidated Appropriations Act. This increased funding made a big difference for a lot of tribes. Of course, we can always use more money as our populations are growing, the challenges are growing, things like that. Also thanking the president for this upcoming 223, $4.5 billion potential, and for your all's time to decide and hear from us where it might be best put the money for our needs. So please stop me at 4:45 into it. I tested this. This is a 9-minute long what they wrote for me. Okay, so strengthening tribal communities. Funding under the Aid to Tribal Government is vital to ATNI's tribes, member tribes. Tribes have an ability to utilize these funds through Indian self-determination contracts to focus the funding to provide numerous tribal government services and functions. This funding provides tribal governments with necessary funds for the different programs and will ensure under proper care, the stability and operations of tribal governments. However, funding is underfunded, leaving tribes without the additional tools necessary to offer core tribal government services. ATNI is requesting a subcommittee increase for aid to tribal governments by $25 million for a total funding of $53.5 million. One of the issues that's so important to all of us is the ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act. This is so important for all of our communities, which was enacted, and it established a ICWA. Also is about custody of our kids and also a competitive grant funding for tribes to operate child welfare services. This grant funding is routinely used to ensure proper placement.
Hey, Nation.
I think one of you isn't muted, so there we go.
There we go. Okay. Grant funding tribes to operate child welfare services. This grant funding is routinely used to ensure proper placement of Native children in foster or adoptive homes, sustain tribal services to intervene in court proceedings, strengthen tribal families, and increase Native foster homes. So funding is so important for ICWA, and we strongly urge putting some more money, $17 million into ICWA programming, and for a total amount of $36 million. As mentioned earlier, natural resources management, the challenges all of the tribes face, whether they're a large-based, land-based tribe or a small tribal-based, like Tulalip. We're only 22,000 acres, but management of our resources, the timber, the water, the rivers, are so important to all of the tribes that ATNI represents. Myself being a fisherman for most of my life, the salmon is dwindling, disappearing. How can we ensure that the salmon survives along with the orca whale out here in the Northwest? Symbols of our culture, of who we are, and any type of monies that goes for natural resources management will help out greatly. Certainly, and then you think about the forest there, one of our land commissioner has a very interesting program for carbon funding, the land commissioner Hillary France, and she's got a great program. I sure hope it succeeds in carbonization of our forests.
I'm going to get you to wrap up if you can.
Okay, if we're there, okay, good. Myself, you have my written comments submitted for the record. Also, being a Vietnam veteran, I want to urge anything funding for all Native American veterans across the country. Currently, I'm 100% disability as Agent Orange related cancer. It'll be a fight till the end for me, but for all veterans, if you all see any money to go for our veterans, I raise my hand to you and say, OCM Haishka Tigwitsi. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your testimony, and we wish you all the best with your health challenges. I just came off of a VA subcommittee myself, and And we want to do everything we can to support our veterans. So thank you for your service and for mentioning that.
Thank you.
Okay, now we'll go into the question portion, and I'll begin with a couple of questions for Chief Francis. In your written testimony, you're supporting increased funding for the tribal courts. I know it's an important issue to you. The FY 2023 President's budget includes an additional 9.5 million over the 22 enacted level for tribal courts. Can you describe some of the challenges that the USIT tribes face with insufficient tribal court funding? And just tell me if all of the USIT tribes receive some tribal court funding.
So thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. And the institutions of tribal courts within sovereign governments are extremely important. USET, like all regions, has a tremendous amount of diversity amongst its memberships, from full law trained courts like ours at Penobscot to various types of traditional based courts, etc. But ultimately, the funding for tribal courts is so extremely important when you're dealing with holistic wraparound approaches in various ways within the court. I use the Violence Against Women Act provisions, for example, that were so very important that this Congress passed recently. Enhancing those jurisdictional capabilities requires funding and opportunity to really strengthen those services, to provide real opportunities to address real conditions. So the funding of tribal courts is not simply about funding a program. It's really about an important institution within any sovereign government that creates not only justice for our people in a culturally sensitive kind of way with restorative justice programs and a whole host of other things, but it's extremely important for the success of any government to have a competent, enhanced judicial system. So we appreciate the enhancements to funding for tribal courts, and we look forward. And again, thank you and our delegation for supporting the Maine tribes being included in the VAWA reauthorization, and recognizing the importance of that institution to the success of our communities.
Well, thank you for that. And as you know, we are very supportive of the bill. That means we wouldn't have to specifically include the Maine tribes into every piece of legislation, but I'm glad we were able to do that. Ms. Kitka, you mentioned a little bit about the real challenges that tribes in Alaska are facing because of climate change. And I know some of the tribes have already had to begin relocating or thinking about that. I have just a couple of minutes, but could you just elaborate some more on the challenges that tribes are facing, and particularly around relocation?
Madam Chair and members of the committee, thank you for the question. Some of the challenges the tribes have is accessing resources to move buildings. We have been doing some really creative things to help the tribes on that. For example, in moving health clinics, when we have a health clinic model, we have a movable model. So we've been looking at other ones. What would be really helpful for some of our communities is support behind project managers that can piece together different resources in order to meet the high costs on that. We've seen success in one community in particular that continually got denied resources for their relocation, but once they got a project manager that was able to communicate in the same way with the different funding agencies, they were able to streamline. The ability to use surplus heavy equipment, both for stand and defend operations where people don't want to relocate, they just want to build up barriers in order to protect themselves from the storms. The ultimate problem is the high cost in relocation and getting suitable land close by to do it. And then it's the physical relocation on that. And we have 7 communities that are one major storm away from being wiped out. And so it's real. People are being really flexible, trying to figure out the best ways to do that. I think that we have good ideas, but like I said, project managers to support piecing the things together and appoint federal agencies that's in charge. During the Obama administration, they designated the Denali Commission as the federal point agency for village relocation. They have a relocation program that they operate that's federally funded. Plussing up their resources on that would go a long way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your response. I hope we can be helpful in that huge challenge you're facing. Now I'm going to recognize Mr. Joyce for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to talk to President Smokey. He's still on. The question I have, sir, is your testimony mentioned the growth of cannabis dispensaries. And I want to ask you something about the local law enforcement problems that you've been in the news. In particular, last year, BIA law enforcement officers raided a home on the land of Picuras Pueblo in New Mexico, and they seized a man's legal supply of medical cannabis, despite the fact that Pueblo passed laws legalizing its use. This discriminatory double standard concerns me greatly. I'm wondering if tribes in Nevada have similar concerns and what we can do to keep the BIA focused on more pressing public safety and justice needs, including missing and murdered Indigenous women and human trafficking.
Yes, thank you. I have not received any word of that type of incidents happening with the tribes that do have legal cannabis in dispensaries in Nevada. But it might be hard to do when you only have 2 BIA officers for the whole entire state. And thank you for bringing that up, because that's actually where the real issue lies, is the lack of law enforcement within the BIA and able to patrol tribal lands for all the tribes in the state of Nevada. But that type of incident specifically, I've not been aware of. It's every tribe has been doing fairly well.
Well, I can't overemphasize the importance of tribal sovereignty, and tribes existed before the states, and tribes have just as much right to continue to govern themselves. It's unconscionable the federal government would take a hands-off approach with the states, but enforce it upon the tribes. It's discriminatory, but it's not right, and it needs to stop. Your testimony, President Smokey, discusses the importance of the Environmental Protection Agency's Indian Environmental General Assistance Program, known as GAP. As you may be aware, yesterday EPA announced proposed changes to GAP program guidance and allocations. Can you take a moment to describe the impact GAP has had on tribes and program changes you might suggest that we could help improve the program's ability to assist tribes in making environmental decisions to better protect their air, land, and waters?
Yeah, so the GAP program has actually been really good to tribes. But as I mentioned even earlier in testimony, that it provides the bare minimum. Tribes are forced to really compete with other tribes and other organizations for outside funding and able to really meet the needs that they have. Tribes do what they can. We're going to do what we can for the best for our people and for our land with whatever we get. But that's what our request was for more funding towards those programs, because when they remain stagnant, then we don't have any additional support, and we're stuck with the programs that we have, and we're not able to move forward while everything else is happening around us. As we talked about the issues with the different changes in climate, we can't address those without additional funding.
I realize others are on, Madam Chair, so I'll yield back, and if there's a second round, I'll take up some time there.
All right, we'll absolutely have more time. So it looks like, Mr. Kilmer, we can take you next. I think we were looking at the order, but please go next.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for holding this important hearing. First, I want to just thank all the witnesses for coming and providing such powerful testimony. I have the honor of representing 12 tribes in Washington's 6th Congressional District. I'm honored to have First Vice President Sheldon from AT&I with us today. As you know, Congress has taken, I think, some much needed and long needed steps to invest in historically underfunded and under-resourced minority serving institutions in recent years. These institutions provide access to education and opportunities to traditionally underrepresented and low-income students. I've heard, though, from tribal members about their desire to see additional investments in our tribal colleges and universities too. Most of our tribal colleges, like the Northwest Indian College in Washington State, which serves over 1,200 students annually from more than 75 different tribes, do not have endowments to support their educational site and their goals. Endowments help institutions admit students who struggle to afford the cost of attendance and conduct research and access new technology and expand and offer academic programs and more. So my questions for Vice President Sheldon or any other witnesses who wish, could you just comment on how additional funding under the Department of Interior's BIE endowment could help tribal colleges and universities carry out their missions?
Thank you, Congressman. Good to see you, and thank you for your kind words. You know, well aware of Northwest Indian College, and they're doing a great job and getting our kids to attend higher education is a challenge because of funding issues. You know, a lot of times too, kids are not ready to go to a college that has 40,000 kids there. And by staying more local, it offers them the time to familiarize themselves with academia, with the time to socialize with other tribal kids and build that foundation so they can be a success in the future, that they'll have the tools as they put more and more tools in. And certainly, like Northwest Indian College and other colleges in Montana that are directed towards Native American kids, funding is a challenge. Not all tribes have the monies to send their kids to school. There's not scholarships everywhere. So if a kid doesn't have the grades, the athletic prowess to get a tuition paid that way, they're kind of out of luck. So the type of funding that we could make available, whether it be through federal funding or programs, would be greatly appreciated. I worked my way through college 20 to 40 hours a week, and that had its own way of educating me, as well as getting my degree at the University of Washington. So, you know, I think anything we can do greatly helps. Thank you for the question.
You bet. Let me direct one more to you. And many tribes in the Northwest and elsewhere have tribal historic preservation officers, or THPOs, who are responsible for consulting with federal agencies and others to protect and preserve and revitalize places of significant historical and cultural importance to tribes. The number of tribes, though, with historic preservation officers has steadily increased over the last 20 years, as well as requests for tribal consultations. So my question to you, Vice President Sheldon, or any other witnesses if you wish, can you expand on the importance of tribal historic preservation officers just when it comes to protecting important cultural and historic sites, and comment on how the BIA could ensure appropriate tribal consultation?
Thank you very much. Yes, that very, very important, that preservation officer, as we work with different agencies, whether it be a city, county, and or state, the opportunity to share with the cultural richness that they may not be aware of is so important. And we're seeing more and more different groups sitting across the table than before, but we still got a long ways to go. For an example, Langley, a small town, they took down their story poles because they were not made by Native American artists in respect to tribes. And so we will meet with their city council, thank them, and then hopefully we will donate a tribal story pole for them in a good way. So a lot of good things happening in that respect. It does make a difference having a preservation officer sharing the culture of who we are and how it affects the non-tribals out there. A lot of times non-tribal people don't know the history of us, our time living on the lands since time immemorial. And so a good education and sharing is always important.
Thanks so much. Thank you, my friend. And thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gilmer. Mr. Stewart, do you have questions you would like to ask?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thanks for holding the hearing, and to all the witnesses, thanks for not only being here today, but for representing your constituents and your tribal interests. And it's very important that you have this interaction with Congress. I mean, if we don't have a chance to talk to you, we're unaware sometimes of the challenges that you face. Maybe we're unaware of the intensity of the challenges. And this is valuable for us to have this interaction with you. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to be very brief. It's a question that's particularly interesting to my, or I should say important to my district and the tribes that I represent in Utah. But I'm wondering if it may be broader than that as well. And particularly, Ms. Kitka, you may have some influence or some background in this, and that is in these very remote areas where many of the Native Americans live now on tribal lands and other remote parts of the West. Emergency air evacuation is a real challenge, and in fact, it's gotten in some places to be nearly impossible. And some of these families live in areas that are, you know, a great distance from not only hospitals but infrastructure, transportation, just a road that's drivable, say in the winter or after heavy rains, for example. And the only way to evacuate people in a medical emergency is with air evacuation assets that are diminishing. And we had a real problem in southern Utah, for example, where the primary contractor there just wasn't able to provide the service because they weren't being reimbursed for it. And it's an issue that we've been trying to work with for more than 2 years now. I'm wondering, are any of you aware of other places that have the same challenge? And I imagine Alaska would be a good example because of the remoteness of some of the tribal lands in Alaska. And if you have any insights that would maybe help us as we try to fix this problem.
Madam Chair, would you like me to respond? Through the chair, yes, no, those challenges, and many of those challenges were exacerbated with the COVID too, trying to medevac critically ill people from really remote communities that had COVID on that. You had a lot of carriers that weren't able to transport people. So that remains for Alaska, our remote communities, a vital transportation. In most of our communities, we're not connected to a road system, and we depend on air traffic, both in healthcare, getting our hospital as a feeder system. So we only have a few hospitals in the state. It feeds from clinics to regional clinics to a regional hospital to our main hospital on that, and air transport, both in the medical field, but for any kind of participation is extremely vital. I know that there are programs that support it and they could use additional resources, but especially looking at the impacts of COVID and how that put carriers out of business or they lost a lot of money during this pandemic. The economic recovery, they need to be shored up.
So Julie, let me pursue that just a little bit. I understand the challenges of COVID and again, those other things we went through in the last couple of years, but putting that aside, do you see the same problem where you have companies that would be willing and could provide this emergency medical or medical transportation, but it's nearly impossible for them again because they're just not being reimbursed at a fair rate? Have you seen that in Alaska, or is that not the same problem there?
I would have to contact our Alaska Tribal Health Consortium and to get you a written answer on that, and be glad to do that to give you some examples on that. I'm sure that we have had that situation, but I can't give you the specifics, but I will get it to you in writing.
Okay, I appreciate that. And so Julie, if you would follow up, because if you're having a problem there, it would help us as we're trying to fix this broadly. Or if any other of the tribal leaders are aware of that, if you would reach out to my office and let us know. Again, we want to represent all of you. And if many of you are experiencing the same challenge, again, if we know about that, it helps us to address it. So thank you. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. We're going to just stick with Nevada here. I think Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank Ranking Member Joyce as well as all of today's witnesses for being here. President Smokey, it's truly an honor to have you here representing the Intertribal Council of Nevada. Also, thank you for your service to our country as both as a member of the Army and the National Guard. You are a true public servant in every sense of the word, and I give you a warm Nevada welcome. I want to ask you a couple of questions about issues that are particularly important to us in Nevada and throughout the West. And you did touch on it in your testimony, the alarming study that we just found that basically says that the U.S. West is experiencing the most worst drought in 12 centuries. Secretary of Interior Holland has emphasized, and I quote, "In this time of climate change bearing down on us, indigenous knowledge about our natural world will be extremely valuable and important to all of us." She added that tribes have been on this continent for millennia, for tens of thousands of years, and they know how to take care of our land. President Smokey, can you speak to how you touched on how the drought is impacting your communities in Nevada and across the West? Could you talk about some lessons that the federal government could draw on for how these communities have been responding both to the current crisis and climate change at large?
Yes, thank you. So I'll give you an example of what we're doing here at the Washoe Tribe around Lake Tahoe. We have groups of tribal members going around actually giving speeches and presenting on how the Washoe Tribe used to use controlled burns around Lake Tahoe area, knowing that it would grow back for maybe 3 or 4 generations to come just to sustain our people. So adding that traditional culture and history to modern day practices is what we're trying to do, because we've been here for a long time. Our people haven't just made it this far for no reason. We adapt, we know the area, we know what needs to be done, and we have that through our histories. Of course, you have to take into account everything modern day, what's going on, but this, when I go back to the wildfires, this was the issue in the first place, was all of these old practices were not being done, and things, every time there's a fire, we want to just put it right out right away because there's houses, residentials, and everything like that, which makes it difficult. But at the same time, we could still be using the old practices to at least mitigate, things that have happened, especially recently in Nevada with the Tamarack fire. That was huge, especially impacting the Washoe Tribe. But there's others all around the state as well, and they're suffering from the same issues. We're all suffering from the same issues: lack of water, drying out, trees dying, cultural foods, medicines. All of those things are happening all across. And each tribe has their specific practices that they have used for their specific areas. So it would really be helpful if the government would listen, and government agencies would listen to those tribes for those specific areas to understand how they have maintained those areas since their existence.
Madam Chair,
I think you're muted.
Could I address the drought? Alaska had the longest duration of drought that lasted for 79 weeks beginning in 2018. So the idea of drought being only in one part of the country, the climate change is also impacting us here in Alaska. So further attention to dealing with that we'd really support that. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'm going to run out of time before I can ask my second question, so I will yield. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Chair McCollum, do you have some questions you'd like to ask?
Yes. First off, thank you, Chair Pingree, for holding this hearing today. And I want to thank all the leaders from the tribal organizations for sharing their testimony for what we can do to work together in a better partnership for Indian country. I also want to add for the record, my thanks to all the national tribal organizations who testified yesterday. I was chairing another appropriations hearing at the same time. unable to hear the testimony in person, but Rebecca Taylor from my office, of course, was on that call. One of the topics that has come up a lot has to do with the president's budget, and it's been getting a lot of attention from tribal leaders, and it's a proposal to move certain accounts to mandatory spending. Contract support costs, payments for tribal leases are proposed to be moved to become mandatory for the Indian Health Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Bureau of Indian Education. As for the IHS, the funding is proposed to shift from mandatory, and that would exempt it from any sequestration in the future. And we need to also protect it for any possible government shutdown in the future. So this is a topic that many of us on the subcommittee have been discussing with tribal leaders such as yourself for a long time. And I'm so excited to see the Biden administration join in on the conversation. There's no question that our treaty trust responsibilities are not getting the investments that they're obligated to get to through discretionary appropriations process. And that's not due to lack of effort for those of us on this committee and for those of us on both sides of the aisle who work with Indian country. But I'd like to take a second just to focus in on an issue that Chief Francis raised, something that I've been working on for 20 years since I got here. And that's the lack of detail from the Office of Budget Management and the funding that reaches Indian country. Now, OMB under its new leadership under Ms. Young, I know it understands this problem and will be a person that we can work with. And as appropriators, we have tried to do our level best to increase funding for Indian country, but it's a challenge for even us here, as close to OMB as we are, to really watch the investments across the various subcommittees. Ms. Pingree and I serve on agricultural subcommittee together, and I know we do our level best to make sure where we can help Indian country in that committee we do. So Chief Francis, could you please, take 2 minutes plus and tell us what a difference it would make if OMB fully funded, had an account so that annually tribes could see what is really being distributed to all of Indian country I'm going to hold up a piece of paper in one spreadsheet.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question, and I appreciate seeing you today. I just wanted to, this is a very important subject. A tribal office within OMB would be extremely important to deal with this level of detail that should be accounted for. The OMB crosscut, as you know, mentions well over $20 billion of resources that are available to Indian country. We in Indian country really feel like that is a grossly inflated number. We believe that includes a lot of money going to states that many times tribes wouldn't have the internal resources or even the understanding that those funds may be available within state governments that tribes could access. It's also important for Congress to be able to understand what the true real starting line is here in terms of the unmet need within Indian country and within tribal communities. So getting that tribal office in a very dedicated way to detail not what is potentially available, what is actually reaching Indian country when we talk about these issues of unmet needs. And I appreciate you raising, the mandatory spending. That's an extremely important issue as well. And they are all tied together in terms of really trying to understand how to meet the trust and treaty obligations to Indian tribes. So when we talk about the historic nature of this budget, for example, and I know we're preaching to the choir here, but when we talk about the historic nature of this budget, it's not really about a numbers driven thing. It's really about how do we create a new paradigm that really says Indian country is not only important, the nation to nation relationship is not only important, we mandatorily now have to seek solutions to these issues that face Indian country. And I think an office at OMB that would detail these reports, not only for Indian country, but for the success of Congress in being able to truly measure how we're addressing the disparities in funding in Indian country.
Thank you, miigwech to all the testifiers, and thank you, Chair Pingree, for holding this important hearing.
Sure, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Joyce, did you have some other questions you'd like to ask?
No, thank you, Madam Chair. They've been addressed through some of the other fine questions that have been asked by our other members.
Great. Yeah, people have been asking some wonderful questions. I'll ask one more, and I think maybe Representative Lee will come back on. Let's see, I think this is for Mr. Frazier. Yeah. The committee for Mr. Frazier, are you available to answer a question?
Yes.
Great, great. I didn't see your, okay, great. So the committee provides funding to the Bureau of Indian Education for tribal education departments, so tribes can have more control of the curricula for Native students. It seems important. In addition, the committee provides Native language immersion funds to BIE and BIA for students who do not attend BIE funded schools. So do you find that funding for tribal education departments and Native language immersion at BIE and BIA is helping to incorporate Native language and culture into elementary and secondary curricular? But do you have any ideas about how to increase or improve the use of these funds? I just want to make sure they're really getting where they need to be and are being effective.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things is really been a challenge for a lot of our Lakota language teachers is to be treated as equal as a teacher that teaches math, etc. What we've seen locally at our BIE and our contract schools is many a times, as particularly with the BIE school, they're definitely paid a lot less. There's not enough time in the day to teach our language and culture. We feel that there needs to be more staffing, because what I see is like one person is just, they're forced to teach many areas such as the culture, the language, the music, and things like that, versus I think there should be teachers for each area, for fine arts, etc. And when you go talk about curriculum, I feel that it's high time to the Bureau of Indian Affairs comes up with standards so where we could teach our children. Right now, they don't have any standards, so we're relied on the state wherever we're located in. And here in South Dakota, that's something in the area of social studies, our governor was trying to eliminate a lot of Native American culture and teachings in the state curriculum. So it's an ongoing battle with that effort. But I really think that if we could get more bodies on the ground in particular different areas, I think we'll be a lot more effective. And earlier I heard a comment, and it was unfortunate that through COVID that we've lost a lot of our elders, too many of our elders with the language and the culture forever gone. So, but I thank you for that question.
Sure, thank you. I don't know if any of our other members have questions. I know it's a busy day and we're getting ready to take votes. So a lot of people have had to leave our Zoom. So unless I see any other hands out there, which I don't, I am just going to thank all of you. I really appreciate the time you took. And not only did you all do a great job with the conversation today, but your written testimony is just full of a lot of rich information that I think will be really important as we put together the FY23 appropriations bill. So feel free to stay in touch. If I don't see any other members raising their hands, I'm going to declare this committee adjourned, and thank you very much for your time.